Hey everybody. In this lecture we're going to be dealing with material from the second half of Lockridge's book. Lockridge's book is a 100-year history of the town, and the first half of the book deals with the first 50 years, the period from 1636 to 1686. And it deals with the founding of the town and the growth of this utopian vision of the town. We're going to start getting into material from the second half of the book that deals with the second 50-year period from 1686 to 1736. And this is the period that Lockridge considers Denham going into decline. But we got to be careful. Lockridge has a very specific understanding of how Denham went into decline. It's not the traditional sense that we would normally think of with, declining population, increasing disease, political strife, civil war, things like that. Almost none of that happens in Denham. Denham continues to be a rather strong, vibrant, growing community in most of the traditional senses. So what does Lockridge mean when he says Denham goes into decline? What declines is that utopian vision and that sort of integrated ideal of the community. Okay, we'll talk a lot more about this idea of decline in a few lectures. But for now, I just want you to know sort of where we're at. We're getting to that second half of the book and starting to talk about a lot of things that are happening in the late 1600s and into the early 1700s. Okay, what we're going to be talking about in particular today is the communal experience in Denham. We're going to be covering a lot of material that deals with the sort of breakup and some of the divisions that start to happen in Denham from that original grant by the General Court in 1635, where Denham was granted 200 square miles. Denham would become several different towns, and there will develop various divisions even within the remaining town. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that. Okay, so here we go. As time goes on, and as the population increases, we start to get second generation, third generation. As land is granted to newcomers and second and third generation people from Denham, the land gets further and further away from the village. So what we have here is a map of contemporary Boston with an overlay of the original Denham grant. This blue line here is what Denham originally was. Now, right here you see the town of Denham today, which is about 10 square miles. It's a suburb of Boston. It has a population of about 25,000 people. That is what was originally considered the village. This is where everybody lived, and farmland was in where some of these new towns were. Okay. What Lockridge says, as the population grew and farmland got further and further away from the village, there was a centrifugal force pushing people away from the village as they were increasingly further and further away. And this moving away from the village was gonna encourage people, among other reasons, to want to create their own town out of this original 200 square miles. So let's take another. This is an image we already looked at in an earlier lecture. This isn't actually Denham, but this is a typical Puritan farming village that we have. So we can imagine this is the village where you have the church and school and the people in their homes and fields surrounding there. What starts to happen as population grows, wooded areas had to be cleared for new farmland as people were granted land further and further away from the village. And this dispersion, this movement away from the village, is going to create new pressures and new strains and new challenges for life in Denham. So let's talk about the creation of the first towns out of this original Denham grant. The first towns were Medfield, Wretham, and Bellingham. The creation of these towns were, for the most part, without much drama. Medfield is, once again, a city in Massachusetts to this day. Some of the names of these areas in Denham changed when they became independent cities. Some of them remain. Medfield was the area it was called in the Denham grant, and when it became an independent city, the name stayed here. So let me show you another map so we can kind of see where that is. All right. Again, this is another contemporary map, but there's where the village of Denham was. We'll look at other maps as we go. Here's Medfield. Okay. Here's Wretham. And here's Bellingham. Okay. As we'll talk in a little while about people moving away from the village. But people that had their land, their farmland, in this area of the original land grant. Oops, sorry about that. Get that back. There we go, close enough. And in Wretham in particular. As we'll talk about, the distance from the village increasingly became a problem as people's farmlands were moving further and further away from the village. And people that had farmland in Medfield and Wretham petitioned the Board of Selectmen for independence, to be able to create their own town. Now, the Board of Selectmen allowed this to happen for selfish motives. There were Native American tribes directly between the village and Medfield and Wretham to the southeast here. And if these towns wanted to be independent, the Board of Selectmen was willing to go along with that because Medfield and Wretham would serve as a sort of buffer zone in case of Native American attack. You want to be our buffer zone, they sort of thought. You want to be the first ones hit by Indian attack? Okay, go for it. And so in 1649, Medfield was granted independence. It was incorporated as a town in 1651. So that's what this symbol here is. It says 16. It might be a little hard for you to make in the video. It says 1649 here. The town was incorporated in 1651, and this was there. It was founded by 13 people, so these are the 13 original founders. These were members of the town of Denham, and they would become the first citizens of Medfield. Bellingham would be a little different. They were so far from the village they wanted to gain their independence. The soil here was pretty bad. It was a very hilly area. Hills aren't necessarily great for farming, at least for the kind of farming that you did back in England, and the kind of farming you would do in New England. And so they were also granted independence a few years later. There wasn't much drama. It was okay. The only thing that had to be sort of worked out a little bit is that the town of Denham had a certain amount of debt that had to be paid. And if you were going to leave and create your own town, you were still obligated to help us pay off some of that debt, is sort of what the village thought. And there was some back and forth about how much they were going to be owed, and that worked out. So when we talk about the problematic nature of this moving away, these towns weren't really part of that. It was okay. 200 square miles was a lot of land. There were some advantages as far as the village was concerned to let these towns go. So there wasn't much drama. Let's start talking about, however, where you do start to get some drama. Okay. As we've been talking about so far in this lecture, as you start to get the second and third generation, their farmland was becoming increasingly far away from the village. And as much as 10 miles away from the village would mean if you're living in the village every day to work your land, you got to go 10 miles. And mind you, this is on foot, maybe on horse. That's a long way to go. And so as early as the 1670s, people in town could apply for convenience grants. A convenience grant allowed you to perhaps acquire some land that was closer to the village. Now, there had to be, initially the idea was there had to be some good reason for this. Maybe you were older. Maybe you had some sort of physical ailment that made walking long distances difficult. Maybe you had handicapped family members that you needed to be near in the village. And so there were mechanisms to apply for this. One of these things we see as time goes on is the increasing use of convenient grants to try to get land closer to the village, and also the more frivolous reasons people gave for trying to get these grants. In the beginning, they were a bit more strict and the people were more serious in applying for them. As time went on and distance got further and people got more tired of walking, the applications became more sort of flimsy. Okay. Now, something else that started to happen as we start getting later into the town's history is people starting to consolidate farmland. So remember, we talked about not only were you given your plot of land in the village for you to live, but you were given strips of land in different places. It was your land, you owned it, but there were multiple strips of land, and the idea is you would work various pieces of land to be in greater connection and contact with other members of the community to increase bonding and offer help and support to your neighbors as they would offer help and support to you. In the beginning, when that utopian spirit was high and people were very enthusiastic about this attempt, people were willing to do this. But as time went on, and particularly as the second and third generation got further and further away from the village, the idea of also walking to different places was being viewed as more burdensome. And so one of the things people started to do was to try to consolidate land. Now, sometimes this was informal, where you wouldn't necessarily change title of land. I still own that strip of land over there, and you still own that strip of land. But hey, partner, what do you say? I'll let you work my piece of land, and we'll consider it like yours over there. And you give me your land to work over there. And so our land is kind of consolidated next to each other, so we don't have to do as much walking. It's still your land over there, and mine's still over there. This avoided any objections from the Board of Selectmen that would not allow that sale to go through. They just wouldn't allow it because they want you to keep working the land in the distance. So you just did it informally. You work all the land there, I'll work all the land there. It'll save us a lot of trouble, it'll save us a lot of effort. But as things started to slip, as that utopian vision became less important to people, including people on the select board, and again, we'll talk about the mechanisms of how this happened, it also became easier to sell and trade land formally, and so you could actually make that land yourself, and you could trade and sell land. And so farmland was becoming consolidated into one area of land. And once your land was becoming consolidated, once you owned all the land, so instead of going back to that sort of earlier image, instead of having a little land here and a little land here and a little land here, instead you have this whole area of farmland, let's say, over here. Now it became easier to consider the possibility of abandoning your home in the village and moving out to your distant farmland. Okay. With this depiction here, it doesn't make much sense because this strip of farmland is awfully close to the village. But imagine your consolidated farmland is 7 miles away from the village. Every day, even though your land's consolidated, you still got to go 7 miles to the village, from the village to your farmland. That's a lot. So what started to happen is people started to, the first step for many of them was to build a barn out on their land, someplace to keep your tools. So at least you didn't have to drag stuff there. And then once people started building barns, some people started to build second homes on this land. And eventually just sort of stop living in the village. Now again, part of this was made possible by that declining utopian spirit. If you'd tried to have done this in the 1630s or 1640s, there would have been a lot of resistance. You would have gotten in trouble. It wouldn't have been allowed. But as you start getting into the 1680s, 1690s, into the 1700s, people don't seem to care as much, and that's why people were doing it. They were starting to live outside, out of the village. And this was not originally part of the vision. I've already talked on multiple occasions with you guys about initially part of that utopian vision was everybody live together, work together, pray together, help each other, try to suppress each other's evil nature. But if everybody's starting to get scattered, living on their own distant farmland, that vision is breaking down. Right? Now, Lockridge tells you guys that this was a typical pattern, not only in New England, but in other places of the world, where you have farming villages where everybody lives in the village. As population grows, increasingly farmland becomes further from the village, and you have this classic tension with younger generations becoming frustrated at the distance by which they have to go from the village out to their farmland. And so this is a classic issue, right? Classic frustration. But Lockridge tells us that the growing disagreements about and the growing desire of some people for independence was more than just complaints about how far they were now living from the village. All right? For some people that had now consolidated their farmland and were now no longer living in the village but living on their farmland, the only real issue they had initially was it's just too far from the village. Everything else they were happy about. They liked the church, they liked the school, they were content with the Board of Selectmen and the town meeting. They were okay with that. But others, Lockridge tell us, had complaints beyond the distance. That it wasn't just the distance. And even for some of them, some of these people, they didn't even live that far from the village. They were pretty close to the village. But the disagreement was about other things, all right? More than, as the title here, grievances of dispersion. It's more than just grievances of being all spread out. An example, all right? These were the towns after the other ones were independent. This is what was left of Denham. And some of these areas are going to become independent towns. Others are going to become precincts. I'll tell you what that means here in a minute here. But let's talk about, so this is Denham Village. This is the area that is to this day the city of Denham, the town of Denham, the suburb of Boston. Okay, this area right here, south and a little east of Denham, was known as Clapboard Trees. Okay, today it's the town of Westwood. Okay, that's what town it is today. Clapboard Trees was was pretty close to the village. Look, it was contiguous with it. It was right there. Lockridge talks about the desire for independence by the people of Clapboard Trees, but says it really wasn't about distance. They weren't that far. There were some other things going on. And he refers to this as grievances of diversity. What was happening in Denham, in that large original 200 square mile tract of land, as some people started to move away, you also got increasing diversity of belief and opinion and of lifestyle. All right. So let's talk specifically about this example of Clapboard Tree. All right. The town of Westwood. Again, here's a contemporary map of Massachusetts. A lot of what the original land grant of Denham is in Massachusetts is the county of Norfolk. All right. This area right here is the original Denham grant, and this is the county of Norfolk today in Massachusetts, right? And so there's Denham, there's Westwood. That's what Clapboard Trees used to be called. So Lockridge tells us the issue was not distance. Instead, the people that had moved out to Westwood were increasingly identifying themselves more with the people of Boston, more with the big city lifestyle of Boston. They thought themselves more like those big city people than the kind of traditional provincial people in the village. Lockridge says that the people that would come to be leaders in Clapboard Trees tended to be wealthier, they tended to be more sophisticated, and they tended to be more religiously liberal. Now, let's be real clear about something. They're still Puritans. The kinds of things that the people of Clapboard Trees were disagreeing with the people of the village, we would still consider to be relatively minor differences. Okay, they were still Puritans and quite faithful Puritans in most cases. But there were some minor differences. And when you're within a religious tradition, sometimes things that from the outside seem like minor differences seem like really big differences to the people that are within this debate. And so that's what we're talking about. So when I say that more religiously liberal, I don't want you to get the idea that, like somehow this was suddenly a town of hippies. All right? It wasn't. They were still Puritans. But nonetheless, what they wanted is they wanted to create their own institutions. They wanted independence. They wanted to create their own church. They wanted to hire their own minister. They wanted their own board of selectmen. They wanted their own town meeting. They wanted their own school for their children. They wanted independence. And so part of what's going on is greater diversity and grievances, as Lockridge's grievances of diversity. People wanted to feel, were starting to feel different from the people in the village. Now, there were some different options possible when we talk about independence. And some of these different options were pursued, and Lockridge talks about these sort of things. For some of these areas, it was possible, if all that really mattered to you was you wanted to create your own church, and you were content with everything else, you could be classified as a parish. A parish is the area that a church serves. Back in England, there was an idea of a sort of civil parish also as a kind of community, and so you could apply to the select board in the village and say, we still want to be part of the town of Denham. We still want to be under the jurisdiction of the town meeting and the board of selectmen. We'd just like to create our own church. That could be granted, and you could be considered a parish. You were still part of the town of Denham, but now you had your own church. If you wanted more than that, if you wanted more independence than just a church, you could be classified as a precinct. Once again, as a precinct, you were still part of the town of Denham. You were still under the jurisdiction of the Board of Selectmen in the village, and you could still participate and were under the jurisdiction of the town meeting. However, you could create your own church, you could create your own school, you could have your own tax assessor that would determine how much everybody in the community owned for taxes and report that back to the village. You could have your own militia where your citizens would train and have your own militia leader. You would still be subject to fight when the town of Denham fought, but you could train and prepare on your own. All right, and so this was the step closest to independence without actually declaring independence. And finally, you could apply for independence. And we've already talked about that. Towns like Medfield had already applied and were granted independence. Now, when Lockridge starts talking about these various areas, some of them gaining independence, some of them becoming parishes, some of them becoming precincts, it can get a little confusing. There's a bunch of dates, there's a bunch of back and forth. So let me try and clarify this as much as you can. I kind of got this timeline here for you. It's in the 1700s where this stuff really starts heating up. So in 1711, Needham becomes an independent city, a town. Okay, the area known as Sawmill, which when it becomes an independent city in 1724 becomes Walpole, is granted independence. Those were done particularly through intervention with the select board. At this point now, the village is becoming increasingly resistant to people leaving Denham. And so now we're getting more intervention in with the general court back in Boston. Okay, 1729, as you'll see, lots of things happening in 1729. Lots of issues, lots of things happening there. In 1729, these different areas were appealing for independence, but were granted precinct status. So that meant they were still technically within the town of Denham. But they could create their own churches, their own schools, their own tax assessors, have their own militia leader, but they were still under the Board of Selectmen in the village and the town meeting. In 1729, this area of Clapboard Trees and Southerly Part were considered as one area initially. The village itself was considered Precinct 1. This was initially Precinct 2. In 1737, this precinct was divided so that Southerly Part became Precinct 2 and Clapboard Trees became Precinct number 3. Springfield in 1729 over here was initially granted as a parish, meaning they could only create their own church, maybe create their own school. But then in 1748 became the 4th precinct that you get there. And so hopefully that's a little helpful, because there's when you're reading the book, there's a lot of dates and there's a lot of back and forth there, but hopefully that clarifies that for you. Okay. Now, let's talk about why all this is, as a way of conclusion, talk about why all this is important. What was really going on, and what Lockridge tries to emphasize in the book with all of this growing division, was that what was really happening was a debate over the nature of community. And why this is so important is because this is something that humans, as long as they've lived together in groups, and as long as they ever will live together in groups, will grapple with this idea of community. The dynamic we're describing in Denham happened all over New England. As populations grew, as people were increasingly further away from the village, people increasingly felt like they were not part of the community. I'm too far away. I live 10 miles away. My kids have to walk hours each way every day to go to school. We don't feel like we gotta walk hours to get to church, to town meetings, to petition the Board of Select Men. We don't feel like we're part of the community. We want to create a new community with people that live around us, with our own schools, our own churches, our own political leaders. Right? And so, while the back and forth can distract us, when did this part become its own town? When was this a precinct? The really important thing to focus on is this idea of the debate over community. The village was often resistant initially to this idea of people leaving because their idea was, wait a minute, we're all part of a community. We're all part of the same family. You can't just up and leave. You can't just up and abandon us. But other people that were increasingly living further and further away from the village felt like, yeah, but we no longer feel like we are part of your community. We still struggle with these issues today in terms of trying to understand what it means to be part of a community. And so that's why it's a really important part of the book and something worth thinking about here. All right. Okay, that's enough for this lecture. I'll see you guys next time.